In 1862, a doctor from Indiana arrived in Washington with blueprints for a weapon he believed would end wars. Richard Gatling had invented a mechanical gun that could fire 200 rounds per minute, more firepower than an entire infantry company. He went to the War Department confident the Union Army would embrace his invention. Officers examined his drawings, listened to his pitch, and politely showed him the door. The weapon was too complicated, they said. It would waste ammunition. Soldiers couldn't be trusted to operate it properly. Gatling left humiliated, his invention rejected, but he refused to give up. Over the next decade, he would refine his gun, demonstrate it relentlessly, and eventually prove that he had created the weapon that would define modern warfare. Richard Jordan Gatling was born in 1818 in North Carolina, the son of a farmer and inventor. His father held patents for cotton planting machines and other agricultural equipment. Young Richard grew up in workshops, learning mechanics and engineering by watching his father tinker with gears and levers. He showed an early aptitude for invention, designing improved farming tools as a teenager. But his ambitions extended beyond agriculture. In the 1840s, he attended medical school in Ohio, earning his medical degree in 1850. He never practiced medicine full-time, preferring invention to treating patients. By the 1850s, Gatling had made a small fortune from patents on seed planting machines. His mechanical wheat drill was widely used across the Midwest, and royalties made him financially comfortable. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Gatling was 43 years old, living in Indianapolis, and deeply troubled by the carnage. Early battles like Bull Run and Shiloh produced casualty lists that shocked the nation. Thousands of men were dying in frontal assaults against entrenched positions. Gatling, thinking like a doctor, wondered if there was a mechanical solution that could reduce the slaughter. His reasoning was counterintuitive. If one soldier could operate a weapon with the firepower of 100 men, armies could be smaller. Fewer men would be exposed to disease and combat. Wars would be shorter because the side with superior firepower would win quickly. It was a naive belief, born from optimism, rather than experience with military realities. But Gatling genuinely believed his invention would save lives by making war so terrible that nations would avoid it. He set to work designing a weapon unlike anything the world had seen. Existing firearms in 1862 were slow and unreliable. A trained soldier with a rifle musket could fire perhaps 3 rounds per minute. Breech-loading rifles were faster, but still required manual reloading after each shot. Gatling's idea was radical, multiple barrels rotating around a central axis, each firing in sequence as the operator turned a hand crank. By the time one barrel fired and needed reloading, several others had already fired. The result was continuous fire at a rate no single-barrel weapon could match. It was mechanically brilliant and tactically revolutionary. Gatling built his first prototype in 1861 in a machine shop in Indianapolis. It had 6 barrels mounted on a wheeled carriage. Turning the crank rotated the barrels, and a loading mechanism fed cartridges from a hopper on top. Each barrel fired once per rotation, then ejected the spent cartridge and loaded a new one. The weapon worked, but barely. It jammed frequently. The paper cartridges of the era were fragile and often failed to feed properly. The mechanism was prone to fouling, but the concept was sound, and Gatling was convinced that refinements would solve the problems. In 1862, he traveled to Washington to demonstrate the weapon to the Union Army. He met with ordnance officers and explained the gun's capabilities. They were polite but skeptical. The Army was conservative by nature, reluctant to adopt untested technology in the middle of a war. Logistics were a nightmare, already without adding complicated weapons that required special ammunition and training. Officers also doubted soldiers' ability to operate such a complex device under combat stress. And there was a deeper concern. The gun seemed almost inhumane, a machine designed solely to kill efficiently. Some officers found it morally troubling. Gatling left Washington disappointed but not defeated. He returned to Indianapolis and continued refining the design. In 1863, he patented an improved version with better feeding mechanisms and more reliable operation. He demonstrated it at military arsenals and fired off letters to generals and politicians. A few officers took interest, including Major General Benjamin Butler, a political general commanding Union forces in Virginia. Butler was impressed by the gun's potential and purchased 12 Gatlings with his own money for use by his troops. It was a small order, but it was a start. The weapon saw limited action in the final year of the war. Butler's forces used them in sieges around Petersburg, where the guns proved effective at suppressing Confederate trenches. But widespread adoption never came. Most commanders ignored the Gatling gun, considering it an expensive novelty. The war ended in 1865, with the weapon still largely unknown. Gatling had poured his fortune into development and received little return. His great invention, which he believed would transform warfare, had been a commercial failure, but he refused to give up. After the war, Gatling moved to Hartford, Connecticut, and partnered with Colt's patent firearms manufacturing company to produce his gun commercially. Colt had the manufacturing expertise and distribution network Gatling lacked. Together, they refined the weapon, switching from paper cartridges to metallic cartridges, which were far more reliable The new version could fire 400 rounds per minute without jamming. Demonstrations became more impressive. Gatling traveled the country and abroad, showing his gun to military officials, journalists, and anyone who would watch. Slowly, interest began to build. The U.S. Army officially adopted the Gatling gun in 1866, but orders were small. The military was demobilizing after the Civil War, and budgets were tight. Foreign armies showed more interest. Russia ordered Gatling guns in 1869. Britain tested them extensively and began deploying them in colonial conflicts. The gun proved devastatingly effective against poorly armed native forces. In Africa and Asia, small British units equipped with Gatling guns could hold off vastly larger forces. The weapon became synonymous with European imperial dominance, a symbol of technological superiority over traditional warfare. The true test of the Gatling gun came during the Indian Wars on the American frontier. U.S. cavalry units began using the weapons in the 1870s, mounting them on wagons and deploying them in battles against Native American warriors. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, General George Custer famously declined to bring Gatling guns, fearing they would slow his cavalry. His entire command was wiped out. Other commanders learned from his mistake. Gatling guns became standard equipment for frontier forts and expeditions. The firepower they provided was often decisive. International sales accelerated through the 1870s and 1880s. European armies deployed Gatling guns in colonial wars across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The weapon's reputation grew with each conflict. At the Battle of Ulundi in 1879, British forces used Gatling guns to devastating effect against Zulu warriors, breaking charges that had previously overwhelmed British infantry. The gun's psychological impact was as significant as its physical lethality. The sound of continuous fire, the visible carnage, and the sense of facing an unstoppable machine demoralized even the bravest opponents. Yet Gatling himself remained conflicted about his invention's use. He had designed the weapon to reduce casualties by ending wars quickly. Instead, it was being used to slaughter indigenous peoples defending their lands. European powers used Gatling guns to impose colonial rule, mowing down resistance with mechanical efficiency. The weapon that was supposed to save lives had become an instrument of oppression. Gatling never publicly expressed regret, but friends noted that he grew more somber as reports of colonial massacres reached him. His humanitarian justification for the weapon rang increasingly hollow. By the 1880s, the Gatling gun faced competition from newer designs. Hiram Maxim invented a fully automatic machine gun in 1884 that used recoil energy to cycle rounds, eliminating the need for hand cranking. The Maxim gun was more compact, faster firing, and easier to operate. European armies quickly adopted it. The Gatling gun, which had once been revolutionary, was suddenly obsolete. Sales declined. Gatling tried to improve his design, creating electric-powered versions that could fire even faster. But the mechanical principle of rotating barrels was inherently more complex than Maxim's recoil-operated system. Richard Gatling died in 1903 at the age of 84, having lived to see his invention both vindicated and superseded. His gun had changed warfare, proving that mechanical firepower could dominate the battlefield. But it had not ended war or reduced casualties as he had hoped. Instead, it ushered in an era of industrialized killing that would reach its horrific peak in the First World War. The machine gun, Gatling's brainchild, became the defining weapon of the trenches, slaughtering millions in a war that was anything but brief or humane. In the decades after Gatling's death, his gun became a historical curiosity. Museums displayed them as relics of the Victorian era. Military texts mentioned the Gatling gun as a precursor to modern machine guns, but gave it little attention. The weapon that had once terrified enemies and impressed generals was forgotten, replaced by more efficient killing machines. Gatling's name faded from public memory. His humanitarian justification for inventing the gun was largely dismissed as naive or disingenuous. Most historians viewed him as an arms dealer who profited from death, not a doctor trying to save lives. But the story of the Gatling gun did not end in the early 20th century. During World War II, aircraft designers faced a problem. Planes flew so fast that pilots had only seconds to fire at enemy aircraft. Single-barrel machine guns couldn't deliver enough rounds in that brief window. Engineers remembered Gatling's rotating barrel design. If powered by an electric motor instead of a hand crank, a Gatling-style gun could fire thousands of rounds per minute. The concept was revived, and by the 1950s, the U.S. military was developing modern rotary cannons based on Gatling's 19th century invention. The M61 Vulcan, introduced in 1959, was essentially a modern Gatling gun. It had 6 rotating barrels and fired 6,000 rounds per minute. Fighter jets like the F-4 Phantom and F-16 Fighting Falcon carried Vulcans as their primary guns. The design proved so effective that it was adapted for other uses. The M134 Minigun, a smaller version, became the standard door gun for helicopters in Vietnam. The GAU-8 Avenger, a massive 30mm rotary cannon, armed the A-10 Warthog ground attack aircraft. Gatling's principle of rotating barrels had been reborn. Today, nearly every military aircraft in the world carries a rotary cannon based on Gatling's design. The weapon he invented in 1862, which was rejected by the Union Army as impractical, is now the standard for aerial firepower. Modern warships mount rotary cannons for close-in defense against missiles and aircraft. Ground forces use rotary grenade launchers and machine guns. The Gatling gun, declared obsolete a century ago, has become ubiquitous in 21st century warfare. Gatling's mechanical genius, dismissed by his contemporaries, is now recognized as foundational to modern weapon systems. The irony is profound. Gatling wanted his invention to shorten wars and reduce casualties. Instead, it enabled industrialized slaughter on a scale he could never have imagined. His gun did not make war obsolete, it made war more lethal. The principle of maximizing firepower through mechanical means, which Gatling pioneered, became the driving force behind a century of weapons development. Machine guns, automatic cannons, and rotary weapons all descend from his original concept. The doctor who wanted to save lives created a tool that has taken millions. Yet Gatling's story is more than a cautionary tale about unintended consequences. It is also a study in persistence against institutional resistance. The Union Army rejected his gun because it didn't fit their understanding of warfare. Officers trained in Napoleonic tactics couldn't imagine how continuous fire would change combat. They saw the Gatling gun as a gimmick, too complicated and too wasteful of ammunition. Only a few forward-thinking commanders, like Benjamin Butler, recognized its potential. If the entire Union Army had adopted the Gatling gun in 1862, the Civil War might have ended years earlier, with far fewer casualties. This pattern repeated throughout military history. Institutions resist innovations that challenge existing doctrine. The British Army ignored the machine gun for decades, even after seeing its effectiveness in colonial wars. French generals in World War I continued ordering frontal assaults despite machine guns slaughtering their troops. American commanders in Vietnam initially rejected helicopters as unreliable. Time and again, military establishments favor tradition over innovation, and soldiers pay the price. Gatling's experience was not unique. It was typical. Gatling's humanitarian justification for his invention may have been naive, but it was sincere. He genuinely believed that increasing the destructiveness of war would make nations reluctant to fight. This theory, known as deterrence through superior firepower, has a long history. Alfred Nobel hoped dynamite would end war. Hiram Maxim claimed his machine gun would prevent conflict. Oppenheimer thought nuclear weapons would make war obsolete. All were wrong. Humans have an infinite capacity to rationalize violence and an unwillingness to be deterred by any weapon, no matter how terrible. The Gatling gun's legacy is thus deeply ambiguous. It was a brilliant mechanical invention that demonstrated the power of applied engineering. It proved that warfare could be industrialized, and that firepower could substitute for manpower. It influenced a century of weapons development and remains relevant today. But it also enabled atrocities, colonial massacres, and the horrific slaughter of the world wars. Gatling's gun did not save lives. It took them more efficiently than ever before. His good intentions paved a road to hell. Richard Jordan Gatling died, believing his invention had made the world safer. He was buried in Indianapolis, and his obituaries praised him as a brilliant inventor and humanitarian. Within a decade, the First World War demonstrated just how wrong he had been. Machine guns turned European battlefields into slaughterhouses. Millions died in frontal assaults against entrenched positions, exactly the scenario Gatling thought his weapon would prevent. The war did not end quickly. It dragged on for 4 years. And when it finally ended, the world was more brutal and cynical than before. Yet Gatling's mechanical genius endures. Engineers still study his designs. The rotating barrel principle is taught in weapons engineering courses. Modern rotary cannons are marvels of precision manufacturing, firing at rates Gatling could never have imagined, but the basic concept is his. In a strange way, the doctor who never practiced medicine has saved lives. Modern close-in weapon systems using rotary cannons have shot down missiles that would have killed thousands. Fighter jets armed with Vulcan cannons have protected ground troops from air attack. The Gatling gun has been both destroyer and protector. The doctor who built a killing machine to save lives. The inventor rejected by the army he tried to help. The humanitarian whose weapon enabled colonial atrocities. The genius whose design was declared obsolete, only to be resurrected a century later. Richard Gatling was all of these, a man of contradictions whose invention changed warfare forever. The Union Army called his gun impractical. History called it revolutionary. And the modern military, which rejected his offer in 1862, now puts his invention on every warplane, every helicopter, every ship. Gatling was right about his gun's importance. He was just catastrophically wrong about what it would mean for humanity. The Gatling gun, rejected in war, vindicated in peace, reborn in the jet age, and forever a reminder that good intentions and deadly efficiency make for a dangerous combination. The weapon that was supposed to end war instead perfected it. And somewhere in that paradox lies the truth about Richard Gatling, the doctor who thought he could heal the world by making it bleed more efficiently.